Chapter 21. Squire Gawky comes to lodge with my master, is involved in a troublesome affair, out of which he is extricated by me. He marries my master's daughter. They conspire against me. I am found guilty of theft, discharged, deserted by my friends. I hire a room in St. Giles, where, by accident, I find the lady to whom I paid my addresses in a miserable condition. I relieve her when I enjoyed myself at large in this temper of mind. Lavement let his first floor to my countryman and acquaintance, Squire Gawky, who by this time had got a lieutenancy in the army, and such a martial ferocity in his appearance that I was afraid he would remember what happened between us in Scotland, and atone for his breach of appointment than by his punctuality now. But whether he had actually forgot me, or was willing to make me believe so, he betrayed not the least symptom of recognition at sight of me, and I remained quite cured of my apprehension, though I had occasion not long after to be convinced that howsoever his externals might be altered, he was at bottom the same individual Gawky whom I have already described. For coming home late one night from the house of a patient, I heard a noise in the street, and as I approached, perceived 2 gentlemen in custody of 3 watchmen. The prisoners, who were miserable, disfigured with dirt, complained bitterly of the loss of their hats and wigs, and one of them, whom by his tongue I know to be a Scotchman, lamented most piteously, offering a guinea for his liberty, which the watchman refused, alleging that one of his companions was wounded grievously, and that he must stand to the consequence. My prejudice in favor of my native country was so strong that I could not bear to see anybody belonging to it in distress, and therefore, with one blow of my faithful cudgel, knocked down the watchman who had hold of the person for whom I was chiefly concerned. He was no sooner disengaged than he betook himself to his heels, and left me to maintain the dispute as I should think proper. And indeed, I came off but scurvily, for before I could avail myself of my speed, I received a blow on the eye from one of the other 2 that had well-nigh deprived me of the use of that organ. However, I made shift to get home, where I was informed of Captain Gawky's being robbed and abused by a company of footpads, and was ordered by my master to prepare an emollient glister and paregoric draught, in order to allay and compose the ferment of his spirits, occasioned by the barbarous treatment he had undergone, while he took 12 ounces of blood from him immediately. When I inquired into the particulars of this adventure, and understood by the servant that he came in just before me, without hat and wig, I made no scruple of believing him to be the person I had released, and was confirmed in my belief upon hearing his voice, to which, before that event, I had long been a stranger. My eye being considerably swelled and inflamed, I could not reflect upon my enterprise without cursing my own folly, and even resolving to declare the truth of the whole story in order to be revenged on the cowardly wretch for whom I had suffered. Accordingly, next day after he had told, in presence of my master, his wife and daughter, who came to him, 1,000 lies concerning the prowess he had shown in making his escape, I ventured to explain the mystery, and, calling in the evidence of my contused eye, upbraided him with cowardice and ingratitude. Gawky was so astonished at this that he could not answer one word, and the rest of the company stared at one another, till at length my mistress reprimanded me for my insolent behavior, and threatened to turn me away for my presumption. Upon which Gawky, having recollected himself, observed, as the young man might have mistaken another person for him, he could forgive his insinuations, more especially as he seemed to have suffered for his incivility, but advised me to be more certain in my conjectures for the future, before I ventured to publish them to the prejudice of any man. Miss applauded the captain's generosity in pardoning one who had so villainously aspersed him, and I began to imagine her praise was not at all disinterested. But the apothecary, who perhaps had more penetration or less partiality than his wife and daughter, differed from them in their sentiments of the matter, and expressed himself to me in the shop in this manner. Ah, mon pauvre Roderick, you have more of de vericite dan of de prudence. Bot mine wife and dater be diablement sage, and Monsieur le Capitaine unfanfuren, party you. This eulogium on his wife and daughter, though spoken ironically by him, was nevertheless literally just. By espousing the cause of gawky, the one obliged a valuable lodger, and the other acquired a husband at a juncture when one was absolutely necessary. The young lady insinuated herself so artfully into the affection of this new lodger, that in less than a fortnight, on pretense of going to the play, they drove away together to the Fleet, where they were married, and in the morning came home, where they asked her father's and mother's blessing. The prudent parents, notwithstanding the precipitation with which the match was carried on, did not think fit to refuse their approbation, for the apothecary was not ill pleased to find his daughter married to a young man of a good prospect, who had not mentioned one syllable on the article of her dowry, and his wife was rejoiced at being rid of a rival and a spy upon her. Whatever face Gawky put on the matter, my discovery of the adventure before related, and the reproaches I vented against him, had stung him to the soul, and cherished the seeds of enmity so strongly in his breast, that he imparted his indignation to his wife, who being as desirous as himself to accomplish the ruin of one that not only slighted her caresses, but was able on any occasion to discover particulars not at all advantageous to her character, readily joined in a conspiracy against me, which, had it taken effect as they expected, would infallibly have brought me to an ignominious death. My master, having several times missed large quantities of medicines, of which I could give no account, at last lost all patience, and in plain terms taxed me with having embezzled them for my own use. As I could only oppose my single asseveration to his suspicion, he told me one day, "Your vord not be give me dissatisfaction, me find necessaire to churcher for my medicine. Pardonnez-moi, il faut churcher, me demand le clef of your coffer a set hura." Then, raising his voice to conceal the fright he was in lest I should make any opposition, he went on, "Oui. I charge you rendez le clef of your coffer. Moi si, moi qui vous parle." I was fired with so much resentment and disdain at this accusation that I burst into tears, which he took for a sign of guilt, and pulling out my key, told him he might satisfy himself immediately, though he would not find it so easy to satisfy me for the injury my reputation had suffered from his unjust suspicion. He took the key and mounted up to my chamber, attended by the whole family, saying, "Eh bien, nous verrons." But what was my horror and amazement when, opening my chest, he pulled out a handful of the very things that were missing and pronounced, "Ah ha, vous eats bienvenue mardi mons. Roderick, you be fort innocent." I had not power to utter one word in my own vindication, but stood motionless and silent, while everybody present made their respective remarks on what appeared against me. The servants said they were sorry for my misfortune, and went away repeating, "Who would have thought it?" My mistress took occasion from this detection to rail against the practice of employing strangers in general, and Mrs. Gawky, after having observed that she never had a good opinion of my fidelity, proposed to have me carried before the justice and committed to Newgate immediately. Her husband was actually upon the stairs in his way for a constable, when Mr. Lavement, knowing the cost and trouble of a prosecution to which he must bind himself, and at the same time dreading lest some particulars of my confession might affect his practice, called out, "Restez, mon fils. Restez, it be veritablement one grand crime which dis pauvre diable have committed. Bot putitred to good God give him de penitence, and me will not have upon mine head de blood of one sinner. The captain and his lady used all the Christian arguments their zeal could suggest to prevail upon the apothecary to pursue me to destruction, and represented the injustice he did to the community of which he was a member, in letting a villain escape, who would not fail of doing more mischief in the world when he should reflect on his coming off so easily now. But their eloquence made no impression on my master, who turning to me said, "Go, miserable, go from mine house quick, quick, and make reparation for your mauvais actions." By this time, my indignation had roused me from the stupefaction in which I had hitherto remained, and I began in this manner. "Sir, appearances I own condemn me, but you are imposed upon as much as I am abused. I have fallen a sacrifice to the rancor of that scoundrel," pointing to Gawky, "who has found means to convey your goods hither, that the detection of them might blast my reputation and accomplish my destruction. His hatred to me is owing to a consciousness of his having wronged me in my own country, for which injury he in a cowardly manner refused me the satisfaction of a gentleman. He knows, moreover, that I am no stranger to his dastardly behavior in this town, which I have recounted before, and he is unwilling that such a testimony of his ingratitude and pusillanimity should live upon the earth. For this reason, he is guilty of the most infernal malice to bring about my ruin. And I am afraid," Madam turning to Mrs. Gawky, "you have too easily entered into the sentiments of your husband. I have often found you my enemy, and am well acquainted with the occasion of your being so, which I don't at present think proper to declare. But I would advise you, for your own sake, not to drive me to extremity." This address enraged her so much that with a face as red as scarlet and the eyes of a fury, she strutted up to me and putting her hands in her side, spat in my face, saying I was a scandalous villain, but she defied my malice, and that unless her papa would not prosecute me like a thief as I was, she would not stay another night under his roof. At the same time, Gawky, assuming a big look, told me he scorned what lies I could invent against him, but that, if I pretended to asperse his wife, he would put me to death. To this threat I answered, "I wish I could meet with thee in a desert, that I might have an opportunity of punishing thee for thy perfidy towards me, and rid the world of such a rascal." "What hinders me this moment," said I, seizing an old bottle that stood by, "from doing myself that justice?" I had no sooner armed myself in this manner than Gawky and his father-in-law retired in such a hurry that the one overturned the other, and they rolled together downstairs, while my mistress swooned away with fear, and her daughter asked if I intended to murder her. I gave her to understand that nothing was farther from my intention, that I would leave her to the stings of her own conscience, but was firmly resolved to slit her husband's nose whenever fortune should offer a convenient opportunity. Then going downstairs, I met Lavement coming up trembling with the pestle in his hand, and Gawky behind armed with his sword, pushing him forward. I demanded a parley, and having assured him of my pacific disposition, Gawky exclaimed, "Ah, villain! You have killed my dear wife." And the apothecary cried, "Ah, Coquin! Vere is my shield. The lady," said I, "is above stairs, unhurt by me, and will, a few months hence, I believe, reward your concern." Here she called to them, and desired they would let the wretch go, and trouble themselves no further about him. To which request her father consented, observing, nevertheless, that my conversation was very mysterious. Finding it impossible to vindicate my innocence, I left the house immediately, and went to the schoolmaster with an intention of clearing myself to him, and asking his advice with regard to my future conduct. But to my inexpressible vexation, he was gone to the country, where he would stay 2 or 3 days. I returned with a design of consulting some acquaintance I had acquired in the neighborhood, But my story had taken air through the officiousness of the servants, and not one of my friends would vouchsafe me a hearing. Thus I found myself, by the iniquity of mankind, in a much more deplorable condition than ever. For though I had been formerly as poor, my reputation was without blemish, and my health unimpaired till now. But at present my good name was lost, my money gone, my friends were alienated, my body was infected by an odious distemper, and my faithful Strap, who alone could yield me pity and assistance, absent I knew not where. The first resolution I could take in this melancholy conjuncture was to remove my clothes to the house of the person with whom I had formerly lodged, where I remained 2 days in hopes of getting another place by the interest of Mr. Concordance, to whom I made no doubt of being able to vindicate my character. But in this supposition I reckoned without my best, for Lavement took care to be beforehand with me. And when I attempted to explain the whole affair to the schoolmaster, I found him so prepossessed against me that he would scarce hear me to an end. But when I had finished my justification, shook his head, and beginning with his usual exclamation said, "That won't go down with me. I am very sorry I should have the misfortune of being concerned in the affair, but, however, shall be more cautious for the future. I will trust no man from henceforward, no, not my father who begat me, nor the brother who lay with me in my mother's womb. Should Daniel rise from the dead, I would think him an impostor, and were the genius of truth to appear, would question its veracity." I told him that one day it was possible he might be convinced of the injury I had suffered and repent of his premature determination. To which remark he answered, the proof of my innocence would make his bowels vibrate with joy. "But till that shall happen," continued he, "I must beg to have no manner of connection with you. My reputation is at stake. I shall be looked upon as your accomplice and abettor. People will say Jonathan Wild was but a type of me. Boys will hoot at me as I pass along, and the cinder wenches belch forth reproaches wafted in a gale impregnated with gin. I shall be notorious, the very butt of slander and sink of infamy." I was not in a humor to relish the climax of expressions upon which this gentleman valued himself in all his discourses, but, without any ceremony, took my leave, cursed with every sentiment of horror which my situation could suggest. I considered, however, in the intervals of my despondence, that I must, in some shape, suit my expense to my calamitous circumstances, and with that view hired an apartment in a garret near St. Giles's, at the rate of 9 pence per week. I one day, when I sat in this solitary retreat musing upon the unhappiness of my fate, was alarmed by a groan that issued from a chamber contiguous to mine, into which I immediately ran, and found a woman stretched on a miserable truckle bed, without any visible signs of life. Having applied a smelling bottle to her nose, the blood began to revisit her cheeks, and she opened her eyes. But, good heaven, what were the emotions of my soul when I discovered her to be the same individual lady who had triumphed over my heart, and to whose fate I had almost been inseparably joined. Her deplorable situation filled my breast with compassion. She knew me immediately, and, straining me gently in her arms, shed a torrent of tears, which I could not help increasing. At length, casting a languishing look at me, she pronounced with a feeble voice, "Dear Mr. Random, I do not deserve this concern at your hands. I am a vile creature who had a base design upon your person. Suffer me to expiate that, and all my other crimes, by a miserable death, which will not fail to overtake me in a few hours." I encouraged her as much as I could, told her I forgave all her intentions with regard to me, and that, although my circumstances were extremely low, I would share my last farthing with her. I begged in the meantime to know the immediate cause of that fit from which she had just recovered, and said, I would endeavor by my skill to prevent any more such attacks. She seemed very much affected with this expression, took my hand and pressed it to her lips, saying, "You are too generous." I wish I could live to express my gratitude, but alas, I perish for want. Then shutting her eyes, she relapsed into another swoon. Such extremity of distress must have waked the most obdurate heart to sympathy and compassion. What effect, then, must it have had on mine, that was naturally prone to every tender passion? I ran downstairs and sent my landlady to a chemist's shop for some cinnamon water, while I, returning to this unfortunate creature's chamber, used all the means in my power to bring her to herself. This aim with much difficulty I accomplished, and made her drink a glass of the cordial to recruit her spirits. Then I prepared a little mulled red wine and a toast, which having taken, she found herself thoroughly revived, and informed me that she had not tasted food for 48 hours before. As I was impatient to know the occasion and nature of her calamity, she gave me to understand that she was a woman of the town by profession, that in the course of her adventures she found herself dangerously infected with a distemper, to which all of her class are particularly subject, that her malady gaining ground every day, she became loathsome to herself and offensive to others, when she resolved to retire to some obscure corner where she might be cured with as little noise and expense as possible. That she had accordingly chosen this place of retreat, and put herself into the hands of an advertising doctor, who, having fleeced her of all the money she had, or could procure, left her 3 days ago in a worse condition than that in which he found her. That except the clothes on her back, she had pawned or sold everything that belonged to her to satisfy that rapacious quack, and quiet the clamor of her landlady, who still persisted in her threats to turn her out into the street. After having moralized upon these particulars, I proposed that she should lodge in the same room with me, an expedient that would save some money, and assured her I would undertake to cure her as well as my own, during which she should partake of all the conveniences that I could afford to myself. She embraced my offer with unfeigned acknowledgment, and I began to put it in practice immediately. I found her not only an agreeable companion, whose conversation greatly alleviated my chagrin, but also a careful nurse, who served me with the utmost fidelity and affection. One day, while I testified my surprise that a woman of her beauty, good sense, and education, for she had a large portion of each, could be reduced to such an infamous and miserable way of life, she answered with a sigh, "These very advantages were the cause of my undoing." This remarkable reply inflamed my curiosity to such a degree that I begged she would favor me with the particulars of her story, and she complied in these words. Chapter 22. The history of Miss Williams. My father was an eminent merchant in the city who, having, in the course of trade, suffered very considerable losses, retired in his old age with his wife to a small estate in the country, which he had purchased with the remains of his fortune. At that time, I being but 8 years of age, was left in town for the convenience of education, boarded with an aunt, who was a rigid Presbyterian, and confined me so closely to what she called the duties of religion, that in time I grew weary of her doctrines, and by degrees received an aversion for the good books she daily recommended to my perusal. As I increased in age, and appeared with a person not disagreeable, I contracted a good deal of acquaintance among my own sex, one of whom, after having lamented the restraint I was under from the narrowness of my aunt's sentiments, told me I must now throw off the prejudices of opinion imbibed under her influence and example, and learn to think for myself. For which purpose she advised me to read Shaftesbury, Tyndall, Hobbes, and all the authors that are remarkable for their deviation from the old way of thinking, and by comparing one with the other, I should soon be able to form a system of my own. I followed her advice, and whether it was owing to my prepossession against what I had formerly read or the clearness of argument in these my new instructors, I know not. But I studied them with pleasure, and in a short time became a professed freethinker. Proud of my improvement, I argued in all companies, and that with such success that I soon acquired the reputation of a philosopher, and few people durst undertake me in a dispute. I grew vain upon my good fortune, and at length pretended to make my aunt a proselyte to my opinion. But she no sooner perceived my drift than, taking the alarm, she wrote to my father an account of my heresy, and conjured him, as he tendered the good of my soul, to remove me immediately from the dangerous place where I had contracted such sinful principles. Accordingly, my father ordered me into the country, where I arrived in the 15th year of my age, and, by his command, gave him a detail of all the articles of my faith, which he did not find so unreasonable as they had been represented. Finding myself suddenly deprived of the company and pleasures of the town, I grew melancholy, and it was some time before I could relish my situation. But solitude became every day more and more familiar to me, and I consoled myself in my retreat with the enjoyment of a good library, at such times as were not employed in the management of the family, for my mother had been dead 3 years, in visiting, or some other party of rural diversion. Having more imagination than judgment, I addicted myself too much to poetry and romance, and, in short, was looked upon as a very extraordinary person by everybody in the country where I resided. I had one evening strayed, with a book in my hand, into a wood that bordered on the high road, at a little distance from my father's house, when a certain drunken squire, riding by, perceived me, and crying, "Hulloa, there's a charming creature," alighted in a moment, caught me in his arms, and treated me so rudely that I shrieked as loud as I could, and in the meantime opposed his violence with all the strength that rage and resentment could inspire. During this struggle, another horseman came up, who, seeing a lady so unworthily used, dismounted and flew to my assistance. The squire, mad with disappointment or provoked with the reproaches of the other gentleman, quitted me, and running to his horse, drew a pistol from the saddle, and fired it at my protector, who, happily receiving no damage, went up, and with the butt end of his whip laid him prostrate on the ground before he could use the other, which his antagonist immediately seized, and, clapping to the squire's breast, threatened to put him to death for his cowardice and treachery. In this dilemma, I interposed and begged his life, which was granted to my request, after he had asked pardon, and swore his intention was only to obtain a kiss. However, my defender thought proper to unload the other pistol, and throw away the flints before he gave him his liberty. This courteous stranger conducted me home, where my father, having learned the signal service he had done me, loaded him with caresses, and insisted on his lodging that night at our house. If the obligation he had conferred upon me justly inspired me with sentiments of gratitude, his appearance and conversation seemed to entitle him to somewhat more. He was about the age of 22, among the tallest of the middle size, had chestnut-colored hair, which he wore tied up in a ribbon, a high polished forehead, a nose inclining to the aquiline, lively blue eyes, red pouting lips, teeth as white as snow, and a certain openness of countenance. But why need I describe any more particulars of his person? I hope you will do me the justice to believe I do not flatter when I say he was the exact resemblance of you, and if I had not been well acquainted with his family and degree, I should have made no scruple of concluding that you was his brother. He spoke and seemed to have no reserve, for what he said was ingenuous, sensible, and uncommon. In short, said she, bursting into tears, he was formed for the ruin of our sex. His behavior was modest and respectful, but his looks were so significant that I could easily observe, he secretly blessed the occasion that introduced him to my acquaintance. We learned from his discourse that he was the eldest son of a wealthy gentleman in the neighborhood, to whose name we were no strangers, that he had been to visit an acquaintance in the country, from whose house he was returning home, when my shrieks brought him to my rescue. All night long my imagination formed 1,000 ridiculous expectations. There was so much of knight-errantry in this gentleman, coming to the relief of a damsel in distress, with whom he immediately became enamored, that all I had read of love and chivalry recurred to my fancy. And I looked upon myself as a princess in some region of romance, who, being delivered from the power of some brutal giant or satyr, by a generous Orundates, was bound in gratitude, as well as led by inclination, to yield up my affections to him without reserve. In vain did I endeavor to chastise these foolish conceits by reflections more reasonable and severe. The amusing images took full possession of my mind, and my dreams represented my hero sighing at my feet, in the language of a despairing lover. Next morning after breakfast, he took his leave, when my father begged the favor of further acquaintance with him, to which request he replied by a compliment to him, and a look to me so full of eloquence and tenderness that my whole soul received the soft impression. In a short time he repeated his visit, and as a recital of the particular steps he pursued to ruin me would be tedious and impertinent, let it suffice to say, he made it his business to insinuate himself into my esteem by convincing me of his own good sense, and at the same time flattering my understanding. This task he performed in the most artful manner, by seeming to contradict me often through misapprehension, that I might have an opportunity of clearing myself the more to my own honor. Having thus secured my good opinion, he began to give me some tokens of a particular passion, founded on a veneration of the qualities of my mind, and, as an accidental ornament, admired the beauties of my person, till it being fully persuaded of his conquest, he chose a proper season for the theme, and disclosed his love in terms so ardent and sincere that it was impossible for me to disguise the sentiments of my heart, and he received my approbation with the most lively transport. After this mutual declaration, we contrived to meet more frequently in private interviews, where we enjoyed the conversation of one another, in all the elevation of fancy and impatience of hope that reciprocal adoration can inspire. He professed his honorable intentions, of which I made no question, lamented the avaricious disposition of his father, who had destined him for the arms of another, and vowed eternal fidelity with such an appearance of candor and devotion, that I became a dupe to his deceit. Cursed be the day on which I gave away my innocence and peace. Cursed be my beauty that first attracted the attention of the seducer. Cursed be my education that, by refining my sentiments, made my heart the more susceptible. Cursed be my good sense that fixed me to one object and taught me the preference I enjoyed was but my due. Had I been ugly, nobody would have tempted me. Had I been ignorant, the charms of my person would not have atoned for the coarseness of my conversation. Had I been giddy, my vanity would have divided my inclinations, and my ideas would have been so diffused that I should never have listened to the enchantments of one alone. But to return to my unfortunate story. After some months, the visits of my lover became less frequent, and his behavior less warm. I perceived his coldness, my heart took the alarm, my tears reproached him, and I insisted upon the performance of his promise to espouse me, that, whatever should happen, my reputation might be safe. He seemed to acquiesce in my proposal, and left me on pretense of finding a proper clergyman to unite us in the bands of wedlock. But alas, the inconstant had no intention to return. I waited a whole week with the utmost impatience, sometimes doubting his honor, at other times inventing excuses for him, and condemning myself for harboring suspicions of his faith. At length I understood from a gentleman who dined at our house that this perfidious wretch was on the point of setting out for London with his bride, to buy clothes for their approaching nuptials. This information distracted me. Rage took possession of my soul. I denounced 1,000 imprecations and formed as many schemes of revenge against the traitor who had undone me. Then my resentment would subside to silent sorrow. I recalled the tranquility I lost. I wept over my infatuation, and sometimes a ray of hope would intervene, and for a moment cheer my drooping heart. I would revolve all the favorable circumstances of his character, repeat the vows he made, ascribe his absence to the vigilance of a suspicious father who compelled him to a match his soul abhorred, and comfort myself with the expectation of seeing him before the thing should be brought to any terms of agreement. But how vain was my imagination! That villain left me without remorse, and in a few days the news of his marriage were spread all over the country. My horror was then inconceivable, and had not the desire of revenge diverted the resolution, I should infallibly have put an end to my miserable life. My father observed the symptoms of my despair, and though I have good reason to believe he guessed the cause, was at a great deal of pains to seem ignorant of my affliction, while he endeavored with parental fondness to alleviate my distress. I saw his concern, which increased my anguish, and raised my fury against the author of my calamity to an implacable degree. Having furnished myself with a little money, I made an elopement from this unhappy parent in the night time, and about break of day arrived at a small town, from whence a stage coach set out for London, in which I embarked, and next day alighted in town. The spirit of revenge having supported me all the way against every other reflection, my first care was to hire a lodging, in which I kept myself very retired, assumed a feigned name, that my character and situation might be better concealed. It was not long before I found out the house of my lover, whither I immediately repaired in a transport of rage, determined to act some desperate deed for the satisfaction of my despair, though the hurry of my spirits would not permit me to concert or resolve upon a particular plan. When I demanded admission to Lothario, so let me call him, I was desired to send up my name and business, but this I refused, telling the porter I had business for his master's private ear, upon which I was conducted into a parlor until he should be informed of my request. There I remained about a quarter of an hour, when a servant entered and told me his master was engaged with company, and begged to be excused at that time. My temper could hold out no longer. I pulled out a poniard from my bosom, where I had concealed it, and rushing out flew upstairs like a fury, exclaiming, "Where's this perfidious villain?" Could I plunge this dagger into his false heart, I should then die satisfied. The noise I made alarmed not only the servants, but the company also, who hearing my threats came forward to the staircase to see was the matter. I was seized, disarmed, and withheld by 2 footmen, and in this situation felt the most exquisite torture in beholding my undoer approach with his young wife. I could not endure the sight, was deprived of my senses, and fell into a severe fit, during which I know not how I was treated. But when I recovered the use of reflection, found myself on a bed in a paltry apartment, where I was attended by an old woman, who asked 1,000 impertinent questions relating to my condition, and informed me that my behavior had thrown the whole family into confusion, that Lothario affirmed I was mad, and proposed to have me sent to Bedlam. But my lady persuaded herself there was more in my conduct than he cared should be known, and had taken to her bed on bare suspicion, having first ordered that I should be narrowly looked to. I heard all she said without making any other reply than desiring she would do me the favor to call a chair. But this, she told me, could not be done without her master's consent, which, however, was easily procured, and I was conveyed to my lodgings in a state of mind that baffles all description. The agitation of my thoughts produced a fever, which brought on a miscarriage, and I believe it is well for my conscience that heaven thus disposed of my burden. For let me own to you with penitence and horror, if I had brought a living child into the world, my frenzy would have prompted me to sacrifice the little innocent to my resentment of the father's infidelity. After this event my rage abated, and my hate became more deliberate and calm. When one day my landlady informed me that there was a gentleman below who desired to see me, he having something of consequence to impart, which he was sure would contribute to my peace of mind. I was exceedingly alarmed at this declaration, which I attempted to interpret 1,000 ways, and before I came to any determination, he entered my room, with an apology for intruding without my knowledge or consent. I surveyed him some time, and not being able to recollect his face, demanded, with a faltering accent, what his business was with me. Upon which he desired I would give him a particular audience, and he did not doubt of communicating something that would conduce to my satisfaction and repose. As I thought myself sufficiently guarded against any violence, I granted his request, and bade the woman withdraw. The stranger, then advancing, gave me to understand that he was well acquainted with the particulars of my story, having been informed of them from Lothario's own mouth. That from the time he knew my misfortunes, he had entertained a detestation for the author of them, which had of late been increased and inflamed to a desire of revenge, by a piece of dishonorable conduct towards him. That hearing of my melancholy situation, he had come with an intention of offering his assistance and comfort, and was ready to espouse my quarrel, and forthwith take vengeance on my seducer, provided I would grant him one consideration, which, he hoped, I should see no reason to refuse. Had all the artifice of hell been employed in composing a persuasive, it could not have had a more instantaneous or favorable effect than this discourse had upon me. I was transported with a delirium of gloomy joy. The contract was made. He devoted himself to my revenge, undertook to murder Lothario that very night, and to bring me an account of his death before morning. Accordingly, about 2 of the clock, he was introduced to my chamber, and assured me that my perfidious lover was no more. That although he was not entitled to such an honorable proceeding, he had fairly challenged him to the field, where he upbraided him with his treachery towards me, for whom, he told me, his sword was drawn, and after a few passes left him weltering in his blood. I was so savaged by my wrongs that I delighted in the recital of this adventure, made him repeat the particulars, and feasted my eyes on the blood that remained on his clothes and sword. My imagination was so engrossed by these ideas that in my sleep I dreamed Lothario appeared before me pale, mangled, and bloody, blamed my rashness, protested his innocence, and pleaded his cause so pathetically that I was convinced of his fidelity and waked in a fit of horror and remorse. I dropped asleep again, and the same apparition recurred to my fancy. In short, I passed the night in great misery, and looked upon my avenger with such abhorrence, that in the morning, perceiving my aversion, he insinuated there was still a possibility of Lothario's recovery. It was quite true he left him wounded on the ground, but not quite dead, and perhaps his hurts might not be mortal. At these words I started up, bade him fly for intelligence, and if he could not bring me tidings of Lothario's safety, at least consult his own, and never return. For I was resolved to surrender myself to justice, and declare all I knew of the affair, that, if possible, I might expiate my own guilt, by incurring the rigors of a sincere repentance and ignominious death. He very coolly represented the unreasonableness of my prejudice against him, who had done nothing but what his love of me inspired and honor justified. That now he had, at the risk of his life, been subservient to my revenge, I was about to discard him as an infamous agent, occasionally necessary. And that, even if he should be so lucky as to bring news of Lothario's safety, it was probable my former resentment might revive, and I would upbraid him with having failed in his undertaking. I assured him that, on the contrary, he should be dearer to me than ever, as I then should be convinced he acted more on the principles of a man of honor than on those of a mercenary assassin, and scorned to take away the life of an adversary, how inveterate soever, which fortune had put in his power. "Well, then, madam," said he, "whatever may have happened, I shall find it no difficult matter to acquit myself in point of honor," and took his leave in order to inquire into the consequences of his duel. I was now more sensible than ever of the degrees of guilt and misery. All the affliction I had suffered hitherto was owing to my own credulity and weakness, and my conscience could only accuse me of venial crimes. But now that I looked upon myself as a murderer, it is impossible to express the terrors of my imagination, which was incessantly haunted by the image of the deceased, and my bosom stung with the most exquisite agonies, of which I saw no end. At length Horatio, for so I shall call my new friend, returned, and telling me I had nothing to fear, delivered into my hands a billet containing these words: "Madam, as I understand it is of consequence to your peace, I take this liberty to inform you that the wounds I received from Horatio are not mortal." This satisfaction my humanity could not deny, even to a person who has endeavored to disturb the repose as well as the life of Lothario. Being well acquainted with this hand, I had no reason to suspect an imposition in this letter, which I read over and over with a transport of joy, and caressed Horatio so much that he appeared the happiest man alive. Thus was I won from despair by the menaces of a greater misfortune than that which depressed me. Griefs are like usurpers; the most powerful deposes all the rest. But my raptures were not lasting. That very letter which in a manner re-established my tranquillity, in a little time banished my peace. His unjust reproaches, while they waked my resentment, recalled my former happiness, and filled my soul with rage and sorrow. Horatio, perceiving the situation of my mind, endeavored to divert my chagrin by treating me with all the amusements and entertainments of the town. I was gratified with every indulgence I could desire, introduced into the company of women in my own situation, by whom an uncommon deference was paid to me, and I began to lose all remembrance of my former condition, when an accident brought it back to my view with all its interesting circumstances. Diverting myself one day with some newspapers, which I had not before perused, the following advertisement attracted my attention. Whereas a young gentlewoman disappeared from her father's house in the county of about the end of September, on account, as is supposed, of some uneasiness of mind, and has not been as yet heard of. Whoever will give any information about her to Mr. of Gray's Inn shall be handsomely rewarded, or if she will return to the arms of her disconsolate parent, she will be received with the utmost tenderness, whatever reason she may have to think otherwise, and may be the means of prolonging the life of a father already weighed down almost to the grave with age and sorrow. This pathetic remonstrance had such an effect on me that I was fully resolved to return, like the prodigal son, and implore the forgiveness of him who gave me life. But alas! Upon inquiry, I found he had paid his debt to nature a month before, lamenting my absence to his last hour, having left his fortune to a stranger, as a mark of his resentment of my unkind and undutiful behavior. Penetrated with remorse on this occasion, I sank into the most profound melancholy and considered myself as the immediate cause of his death. I lost all relish for company, and, indeed, most of my acquaintances no sooner perceived my change of temper than they abandoned me. Horatio, disgusted at my insensibility, or from some other cause, became colder and colder every day, till at last he left me altogether, without making any apology for his conduct, or securing me against the miseries of want, as a man of honor ought to have done, considering the share he had in my ruin. For I afterwards learned that the quarrel between Lothario and him was a story trumped up to rid the one of my importunities, and give the other a recommendation to me, which, it seems, he desired, upon seeing me at the house of my seducer. Reduced to this extremity, I cursed my own simplicity, uttered horrid imprecations against the treachery of Horatio, and, as I became every day more and more familiarized to the loss of innocence, resolved to be revenged on the sex in general, by practicing their own arts upon themselves. Nor was an opportunity long wanting. An old gentlewoman, under pretense of sympathizing, visited me, and after having condoled me on my misfortunes, and professed a disinterested friendship, began to display the art of her occupation, in encomiums on my beauty, and invectives against the wretch who had forsaken me, insinuating withal that it would be my own fault if I did not still make my fortune by the extraordinary qualifications with which nature had endowed me. I soon understood her drift, and gave her such encouragement to explain herself, that we came to an agreement immediately to divide whatever profits might accrue from such gallants as she should introduce to my acquaintance. The first stroke of my dissimulation was practiced upon a certain judge, to whom I was recommended by this matron as an innocent creature just arrived from the country. Chapter 23. Miss Williams interrupted by a bailiff, who carries her to the Marshalsea. I accompany her, prove she is not the person named in the writ. The bailiff is fain to discharge her. We shift our lodging, her story, and my reflections thereupon, progress of a common woman of the town, resolves to quit that way of life. Her story was here interrupted by a rap at the door, which I no sooner opened than 3 or 4 terrible fellows rushed in, one of whom accosted my fellow-lodger thus: "Madam, your servant, you must do me the favor to come along with me. I have a writ against you." While the bailiff, for so he was, spoke thus, his followers surrounded the prisoner and began to handle her very roughly. This treatment incensed me so much that I snatched up the poker and would certainly have used it in defense of the lady, without any regard to the strength and number of her adversaries, had she not begged me, with a composure of countenance for which I could not account, to use no violence on her behalf, which could be of no service to her, but might be very detrimental to myself. Then turning to the leader of this formidable troop, she desired to see the writ, and having perused it, said with a faltering voice, "I am not the person whose name is here mentioned. Arrest me at your peril." "Aye, aye, madam," replied the catchpole. "We shall prove your identity. In the meantime, whither will you be pleased to be carried, to my house or to jail?" "If I must be confined," said she, "I would rather be in your house than in a common jail." "Well, well," answered he, "if you have money enough in your pocket, you shall be entertained like a princess." But when she acquainted him with her poverty, he swore he never gave credit, and ordered one of his myrmidons to call a coach to carry her to the Marshalsea at once. While they waited for the convenience, she took me aside and bade me be under no concern on her account, for she knew how to extricate herself from this difficulty very soon, and perhaps gain something by the occasion. Although her discourse was a mystery to me, I was very well pleased with her assurance, and when the coach came to the door, I offered to accompany her to prison, to which proposal, after much entreaty, she consented. When we arrived at the gate of the Marshalsea, our conductor alighted, and having demanded entrance, presented the writ to the turnkey, who no sooner perceived the name of Elizabeth Carey than he cried, "Ah, my old acquaintance Bet. I'm glad to see thee with all my heart." So saying, he opened the coach door and helped her to dismount, but when he observed her face, he started back, saying, "Who have we got here?" The bailiff, alarmed at this interrogation, cried with some emotion, "Who should it be but the prisoner Elizabeth Carey?" The turnkey replied, "That Elizabeth Carey. I'll be hanged if that's Elizabeth Carey more than my grandmother." Here the lady thought fit to interpose and tell the catchbull, if he had taken her word for it at first, he might have saved himself and her a great deal of trouble. "It may be so," answered he, "but I'll have further evidence that you are not the person before you and I part." Yes, said she, "you shall have further evidence to your cost." Then we adjourned into the lodge and called for a bottle of wine, where my companion wrote a direction to two of her acquaintance, and begged the favor of me to go to their lodgings and request them to come to her immediately. I found them together at a house in Bridges Street, Drury Lane, and as they were luckily unengaged, they set out with me in a hackney coach without hesitation, after I had related the circumstances of the affair, which flattered them with the hopes of seeing a bailiff trounced. For there is an antipathy as natural between women of that class and bailiffs as that subsisting between mice and cats. Accordingly, when they entered the lodge, they embraced the prisoner very affectionately by the name of Nancy Williams, and asked how long she had been nabbed, and for what. On hearing the particulars of her adventure repeated, they offered to swear before a justice of peace that she was not the person mentioned in the writ, whom, it seems, they all knew. But the bailiff, who was by the time convinced of his mistake, told them he would not put them to that trouble. "Ladies," said he, "there's no harm done. You shall give me leave to treat you with another bottle, and then we'll part friends." This proposal was not at all relished by the sisterhood, and Miss Williams told him, sure he did not imagine her such a fool as to be satisfied with a paltry glass of sour wine. Here the turnkey interrupted her by affirming with an oath that the wine was as good as ever was tipped over tongue. "Well," continued she, "that may be, but were it the best of champagne, it is no recompense for the damage I have suffered both in character and health, by being wrongfully dragged to jail. At this rate, no innocent person is safe, since an officer of justice, out of malice, private pique, or mistake, may injure and oppress the subject with impunity. But, thank heaven, I live under the protection of laws that will not suffer such insults to pass unpunished, and I know very well how to procure redress. Mr. Vulture, for that was the bailiff's name, finding he had to deal with one who would not be imposed upon, began to look very sullen and perplexed, and leaning his forehead on his hand, entered into a deliberation with himself, which lasted a few minutes, and then broke out in a volley of dreadful curses against the old jade, our landlady, as he called her, for having misinformed him. After much wrangling and swearing, the matter was referred to the decision of the turnkey, who, calling for the other bottle, mulcted the bailiff in all the liquor that had been drunk, coach hire, and a couple of guineas for the use of the plaintiff. The money was immediately deposited. Miss Williams gratified the two evidences with 1/2, and putting the other in her pocket drove home with me, leaving the catchbull grumbling over his loss, yet pleased in the main, for having so cheaply got clear of a business that might have cost him 10 times the sum, and his place to boot. This guinea was a very seasonable relief to us, who were reduced to great necessity, 6 of my shirts, and almost all my clothes, except those on my back, having been either pawned or sold for our maintenance before this happened. As we resented the behavior of our landlady, our first care was to provide ourselves with another lodging, whither we removed next day, with an intention to keep ourselves as retired as possible until our cure should be completed. When we were fixed in our new habitation, I entreated her to finish the story of her life, which she pursued in this manner. The success of our experiment on the judge encouraged us to practice the same deceit on others. But this harvest lasted not long, my character taking air, and my directress deserting me for some new game. Then I took lodgings near Charing Cross, at 2 guineas a week, and began to entertain company in a public manner. But my income being too small to defray my expenses, I was obliged to retrench and enter into articles with the porters of certain taverns, who undertook to find employment enough for me, provided I would share my profits with them. Accordingly, I was almost every night engaged with company, among whom I was exposed to every mortification, danger, and abuse that flow from drunkenness and brutality. As my spirit was not sufficiently humbled to the will, nor my temper calculated for the conversation of my gallants, it was impossible for me to overcome an aversion I felt for my profession, which manifested itself in a settled gloom on my countenance, and disgusted those sons of mirth and riot so much that I was frequently used in a shocking manner and kicked down stairs with disgrace. The messengers, seeing me disagreeable to their benefactors and employers, seldom troubled me with a call, and I began to find myself almost totally neglected. To contribute towards my support, I was fain to sell my watch, rings, trinkets, with the best part of my clothes, and I was one evening musing by myself on misery before me when I received a message from a tavern, whither I repaired in a chair, and was introduced to a gentleman dressed like an officer, with whom I supped in a sumptuous manner. In the morning, when I awoke, I found my gallant had got up, and drawing aside the curtain, could not perceive him in the room. I waited a full hour for his return, and then in the greatest perplexity, rose up and rang the bell. When the waiter came to the door, he found it locked, and desired admittance, which I granted, after observing, with great surprise, that the key remained on the inside, as when we went to bed. I no sooner inquired for the captain than the fellow, staring with a distracted look, cried, "How, madam, is he not abed?" And when he was satisfied as to that particular, ran into a closet adjoining to the chamber, the window of which he found open. Through this the adventurer had got upon a wall, from whence he dropped down into a court and escaped, leaving me to be answerable not only for the reckoning, but also for a large silver tankard and posset bowl, which he had carried off with him. It is impossible to describe the consternation I was under when I saw myself detained as a thief's accomplice, for I was looked upon in that light and carried before a justice, who, mistaking my confusion for a sign of guilt, committed me, after a short examination, to Bridewell, having admonished me, as the only means to save my life, to turn evidence and impeach my confederate. I now concluded the vengeance of heaven had overtaken me, and that I must soon finish my career by an ignominious death. This reflection sank so deep into my soul that I was for some days deprived of my reason, and actually believed myself in hell, tormented by fiends. Indeed, there needs not a very extravagant imagination to form that idea, for of all the scenes on earth, that of Bridewell approaches nearest the notion I had always entertained of the regions. Here I saw nothing but rage, anguish, and impiety, and heard nothing but groans, curses, and blasphemy. In the midst of this hellish crew, I was subjected to the tyranny of a barbarian, who imposed upon me tasks that I could not possibly perform, and then punished my incapacity with the utmost rigor and inhumanity. I was often whipped into a swoon and lashed out of it, during which miserable interval I was robbed by my fellow prisoners of everything about me, even to my cap, shoes, and stockings. I was not only destitute of necessaries, but even of food, so that my wretchedness was extreme. Not one of my acquaintance to whom I imparted my situation would grant me the least succor or regard, on pretense of my being committed for theft, and my landlord refused to part with some of my own clothes which I sent for, because I was indebted to him for a week's lodging. Overwhelmed with calamity, I grew desperate, and resolved to put an end to my grievances and life together. For this purpose I got up in the middle of the night, when I thought everybody around me asleep, and fixing one end of a large hook in the ceiling that supported the scales on which the hemp is weighed, I stood upon a chair, and making a noose on the other end, put my neck into it, with an intention to hang myself. But before I could adjust the knot, I was surprised and prevented by two women, who had been awake all the while and suspected my design. In the morning, my attempt was published among the prisoners and punished with 30 stripes, the pain of which, co-operating with my disappointment and disgrace, bereft me of my senses and threw me into an ecstasy of madness, during which I tore the flesh from my bones with my teeth and dashed my head against the pavement, so that they were obliged to set a watch over me, to restrain me from doing further mischief to myself and others. This fit of frenzy continued 3 days, at the end of which I grew calm and sullen. But as the desire of making away with myself still remained, I came to a determination of starving myself to death, and with that view refused all sustenance. Whether it was owing to the want of opposition or to the weakness of nature, I know not. But on the 2nd day of my fast, I found my resolution considerably impaired, and the calls of hunger almost insupportable. At this critical conjuncture, a lady was brought into the prison, with whom I had contracted an acquaintance while I lived with Horatio. She was then on the same footing as I was, but afterwards quarreling with her gallant, and not finding another to her mind, altered her scheme of life, and set up a coffee house among the hundreds in Drury, where she entertained gentlemen with claret, arrack, and the choice of 6 damsels who lived in her house. This serviceable matron, having neglected to gratify a certain justice for the connivance she enjoyed, was indicted at the quarter sessions, in consequence of which her bevy was dispersed, and herself committed to Bridewell. She had not been long there before she learned my disaster, and coming up to me, after a compliment of condolence, inquired into the particulars of my fate. While we were engaged in discourse together, the master came and told me that the fellow on whose account I had suffered was taken, that he had confessed the theft, and cleared me of any concern in the affair, for which reason he, the master, had orders to discharge me, and that I was from that moment free. This piece of news soon banished all thoughts of death, and had such an instantaneous effect on my countenance, that Mrs. Coupler, the lady then present, hoping to find her account in me, very generously offered to furnish me with what necessaries I wanted, and take me into her own house as soon as she could compromise matters with the justices. The conditions of her offer were that I should pay 3 guineas weekly for my board, and a reasonable consideration besides, for the use of such clothes and ornaments as she should supply me with, to be deducted from the first profits of my occupation. These were hard terms, but not to be rejected by one who was turned out helpless and naked into the wide world, without a friend to pity or assist her. I therefore embraced her proposal, and she being bylaid in a few hours, took me home with her in a coach. As I was by this time conscious of having formerly disgusted my admirers by my reserved, loud, haughty behavior, I now endeavored to conquer that disposition, and the sudden change of my fortune giving me a flow of spirits, I appeared in the most winning and gay manner I could assume. Having the advantage of a good voice and education, I exerted my talents to the uttermost, and soon became the favorite with all company. This success alarmed the pride and jealousy of Mrs. Coupler, who could not bear the thoughts of being eclipsed. She therefore made a merit of her envy and whispered among the customers that I was unsound. There needed no more to ruin my reputation and blast my prosperity. Everybody shunned me with marks of aversion and disdain, and in a very short time I was as solitary as ever. Want of gallants was attended with want of money to satisfy my malicious landlady, who, having purposely given me credit to the amount of £11, took out a writ against me, and I was arrested in her own house. Though the room was crowded with people when the bailiff entered, not one of them had compassion enough to mollify my prosecutrix, far less to pay the debt. They even laughed at my tears, and one of them bade me be of good cheer, for I should not want admirers in Newgate. At this instant, a sea lieutenant came in, and seeing my plight, began to inquire into the circumstances of my misfortune. "Hark ye, my girl," he inquired, "how far have you overrun the constable?" I told him that the debt amounted to £11, besides the expenses of the writ. "And that be all," said he. "You shan't go to the bilboes this bout." And taking out his purse, he paid the money, discharged the bailiff, and telling me I had got into the wrong port, advised me to seek out a more convenient harbor, where I could be safely hove down, for which purpose he made me a present of 5 guineas more. I was so touched with this singular piece of generosity that for some time I had not power to thank him. However, as soon as I recollected myself, I begged the favor of him to go with me to the next tavern, where I explained the nature of my disaster, and convinced him of the falsehood of what was reported to my prejudice so effectually, that he from that moment attached himself to me, and we lived in great harmony together, until he was obliged to go to sea, where he perished in a storm. Having lost my benefactor, and almost consumed the remains of his bounty, I saw myself in danger of relapsing into my former necessity, and began to be very uneasy at the prospect of bailiffs and jails. When one of the sisterhood advised me to take lodgings in a part of the town where I was unknown, and pass for an heiress, by which artifice I might entrap somebody to be my husband, who would possibly be able to allow me a handsome maintenance, or at worst screen me from the dread and danger of a prison, by becoming liable for whatever debts I should contract. I approved of this scheme, towards the execution of which my companion clubbed her wardrobe, and undertook to live with me in quality of my maid, with the proviso that she should be reimbursed and handsomely considered out of the profits of my success. She was immediately detached to look out for a convenient place, and that very day hired a genteel apartment in Park Street, whither I moved in a coach loaded with her baggage and my own. I made my first appearance in a blue riding habit trimmed with silver, and my maid acted her part so artfully that in a day or two my fame spread all over the neighborhood, and I was said to be a rich heiress just arrived from the country. This report brought a swarm of gay young fellows about me, but I soon found them to be all indigent adventurers like myself, who crowded to me like crows to a carrion, with a view of preying upon my fortune. I maintained, however, the appearance of wealth as long as possible, in hopes of gaining some admirer more for my purpose, and at length attracted the regard of one who would have satisfied my wishes, and managed matters so well that a day was actually fixed for our nuptials. In the interim, he begged leave to introduce an intimate friend to me, which request, as I could not refuse, I had the extreme mortification and surprise to see. Next night, in that friend, my old keeper Horatio, who no sooner beheld me than he changed color, but had presence of mind to advance and salute me, bidding me, with a low voice, be under no apprehension, for he would not expose me. In spite of his assurance, I could not recover myself so far as to entertain them, but withdrew to my chamber on pretense of a severe headache, to the no small concern of my adorer, who took his leave in the tenderest manner and went off with his friend. Having imparted my situation to my companion, she found it high time for us to decamp, and that without any noise, because we were not only indebted to our landlady, but also to several tradesmen in the neighborhood. Our retreat, therefore, was concerted and executed in this manner. Having packed up all our clothes and movables in small parcels, she, on pretense of fetching cordials for me, carried them at several times to the house of an acquaintance, where she likewise procured a lodging, to which we retired in the middle of the night, when every other body in the house was asleep. I was now obliged to aim at lower game, and accordingly spread my nets among tradespeople, but found them all too phlegmatic or cautious for my art and attractions, till at last I became acquainted with you, on whom I practiced all my dexterity. Not that I believed you had any fortune or expectation of me, but that I might transfer the burden of such debts as I had incurred, or should contract, from myself to another, and at the same time avenge myself of your sex, by rendering miserable one who bore such resemblance to the wretch who ruined me. But heaven preserved you from my snares by the discovery you made, which was owing to the negligence of my maid in leaving the chamber door unlocked when she went to buy sugar for breakfast. When I found myself detected and forsaken by you, I was fain to move my lodging and dwell 2 pair of stairs higher than before. My companion, being disappointed in her expectations, left me, and I had no other resource than to venture forth, like the owls in the dark, to pick up a precarious and uncomfortable subsistence. I have often sauntered between Ludgate Hill and Charing Cross a whole winter night, exposed not only to the inclemency of the weather, but likewise to the rage of hunger and thirst, without being so happy as to meet with one dupe, then creep up to my garret in a deplorable draggled condition, sneak to bed, and try to bury my appetite and sorrows in sleep. When I lighted on some rake or tradesman reeling home drunk, I frequently suffered the most brutal treatment, in spite of which I was obliged to affect gaiety and good humor, though my soul was stung with resentment and disdain, and my heart loaded with grief and affliction. In the course of these nocturnal adventures, I was infected with the disease that in a short time rendered me the object of my own abhorrence, and drove me to the retreat where your benevolence rescued me from the jaws of death. So much candor and good sense appeared in this lady's narration that I made no scruple of believing every syllable of what she said, and expressed my astonishment at the variety of miseries she had undergone in so little time, for all her misfortunes had happened within the compass of 2 years. I compared her situation with my own, and found it 1,000 times more wretched. I had endured hardships, 'tis true. My whole life had been a series of such, and when I looked forward, the prospect was not much bettered, but then they were become habitual to me, and consequently I could bear them with less difficulty. If one scheme of life should not succeed, I could have recourse to another, and so to a third, veering about to 1,000 different shifts, according to the emergencies of my fate, without forfeiting the dignity of my character beyond a power of retrieving it, or subjecting myself wholly to the caprice and barbarity of the world. On the other hand, she had known and relished the sweets of prosperity. She had been brought up under the wings of an indulgent parent, in all the delicacies to which her sex and rank entitled her, and without any extravagance of hope, entertained herself with the view of uninterrupted happiness through the whole scene of life. How fatal, then, how tormenting, how intolerable must her reverse of fortune be? A reverse that not only robs her of these external comforts and plunges her into all the miseries of want, but also murders her peace of mind, and entails upon her the curse of eternal infamy. Of all professions, I pronounced that of a courtesan the most deplorable, and her of all courtesans the most unhappy. She allowed my observation to be just in the main, but at the same time affirmed that notwithstanding the disgraces which had fallen to her share, she had not been so unlucky in the condition of a prostitute as many others of the same community. "I have often seen," said she, "while I strolled about the streets at midnight, a number of naked wretches reduced to rags and filth, huddled together like swine, in the corner of a dark alley, some of whom, but 18 months before, I had known the favorites of the town, rolling in affluence and glittering in all the pomp of equipage and dress. Miserable wretch that I am! Perhaps the same horrors are decreed for me. No," cried she after some pause, "I shall never live to such extremity of distress. My own hand shall open a way for my deliverance before I arrive at that forlorn period." Her condition filled me with sympathy and compassion. I revered her qualifications, looked upon her as unfortunate, not criminal, and attended her with such care and success that in less than 2 months her health, as well as my own, was perfectly re-established. As we often conferred upon our mutual affairs and interchanged advice, 1,000 different projects were formed, which, upon further canvassing, appeared impracticable. We would have gladly gone to service, but who would take us in without recommendation? At length an expedient occurred to her, of which she intended to lay hold, and this was to procure with the first money she should earn the homely garb of a country wench, go to some village at a good distance from town, and come up in a wagon as a fresh girl for service, by which means she might be provided for in a manner much more suitable to her inclination than her present way of life. Chapter 24. I am reduced to a great misery, assaulted on Tower Hill by a press gang who put me on board a tender, my usage there, my arrival on board at a man-o'-war where I am put in irons and released by the good offices of Mr. Thompson, who recommends me as assistant to the surgeon. He relates his own story. Characters of the captain, surgeon, and first mate. I applauded the resolution of Miss Williams, who a few days after was hired in quality of barkeeper by one of the ladies who had witnessed in her behalf at the Marshalsea, and who since that time had got credit with a wine merchant, whose favorite she was, to set up a convenient house of her own. Thither my fellow lodger repaired, after having taken leave of me with a torrent of tears and 1,000 protestations of eternal gratitude, assuring me she would remain in this situation no longer than she could pick up money sufficient to put her other design in execution. As for my own part, I saw no resource but the army or navy, between which I hesitated so long that I found myself reduced to a starving condition. My spirit began to accommodate itself to my beggarly fate, and I became so mean as to go down towards Wapping, with an intention to inquire for an old schoolfellow, who, I understood, had got the command of a small coasting vessel then in the river, and implore his assistance. But my destiny prevented this abject piece of behavior, for as I crossed Tower Wharf, a squat tawny fellow with a hanger by his side and a cudgel in his hand came up to me, calling, "Yo-ho! Brother, you must come along with me." As I did not like his appearance, instead of answering his salutation, I quickened my pace in hope of ridding myself of his company, upon which he whistled aloud, and immediately another sailor appeared before me, who laid hold of me by the collar and began to drag me along. Not being in a humor to relish such treatment, I disengaged myself of the assailant, and with one blow of my cudgel, laid him motionless on the ground, and perceiving myself surrounded in a trice by 10 or a dozen more, exerted myself with such dexterity and success that some of my opponents were fain to attack me with drawn cutlasses. And after an obstinate engagement, in which I received a large wound on my head and another on my left cheek, I was disarmed, taken prisoner, and carried on board a pressing tender, where, after being pinioned like a malefactor, I was thrust down into the hold among a parcel of miserable wretches, the sight of whom well-nigh distracted me. As the commanding officer had not humanity enough to order my wounds to be dressed, and I could not use my own hands, I desired one of my fellow captives who was unfettered to take a handkerchief out of my pocket and tie it round my head to stop the bleeding. He pulled out my handkerchief. 'Tis true, but instead of applying it to the use for which I designed it, went to the grating of the hatchway, and with astonishing composure sold it before my face to a bumboat woman. One, then on board, for a quart of gin, with which he treated his companions, regardless of my circumstances and entreaties. One, a bumboat woman is one who sells bread, cheese, greens, liquor, and fresh potatoes to the sailors. In a small boat that lies alongside the ship, I complained bitterly of this robbery to the midshipman on deck, telling him at the same time that unless my hurts were dressed, I should bleed to death. But compassion was a weakness of which no man could justly accuse this person, who, squirting a mouthful of dissolved tobacco upon me through the gratings, told me I was a mutinous dog, and that I might die for anything he cared. Finding there was no other remedy, I appealed to patience, and laid up this usage in my memory, to be called at a more fitting opportunity. In the meantime, loss of blood, vexation, and want of food contributed with the noisome stench of the place to throw me into a swoon, out of which I was recovered by a tweak of the nose, administered by the tar who stood sentinel over us, who at the same time regaled me with a draught of flip, and comforted me with the hopes of being put on board of the Thunder next day, where I should be freed of my handcuffs and cured of my wounds by the doctor. I no sooner heard him name the Thunder than I asked if he had belonged to that ship long, and be giving me to understand he had belonged to her 5 years, I inquired if he knew Lieutenant Bowling. "No, Lieutenant Bowling," said he, "odds my life." "And that I do, and a good seaman he is as ever stepped upon forecastle, and a brave fellow as ever cracked biscuit. None of your guinea pigs, nor your fresh water, wish-washy, fair-weather fowls. Many a taut gale of wind have honest Tom Bowling, and I weathered together. Here's his health with all my heart. Wherever he is, aloft or alow, the lieutenant needs not be ashamed to show himself." I was so much affected with this eulogium that I could not refrain from telling him that I was Lieutenant Bowling's kinsman, in consequence of which connection he expressed his inclination to serve me, and when he was relieved, brought some cold boiled beef in a platter and biscuit, on which we supped plentifully, and afterwards drank another can of flip together. While we were thus engaged, he recounted a great many exploits of my uncle, who, I found, was very much beloved by the ship's company, and pitied for the misfortune that had happened to him in Hispaniola, which I was very glad to be informed was not so great as I imagined. For Captain Oakham had recovered of his wounds, and actually at that time commanded the ship. Having by accident in my pocket my uncle's letter, written from Port Louis, I gave it my benefactor, whose name was Jack Ratlin, for his perusal. But honest Jack told me frankly he could not read, and desired to know the contents, which I immediately communicated. When he heard that part of it in which he says he had written to his landlord in Deal, he cried, "Body o' me!" That was old Ben Block. He was dead before the letter came to hand. Aye, had Ben been alive, Lieutenant Bowling would have had no occasion to skulk so long. Honest Ben was the first man that taught him to hand, reef, and steer. Well, we must all die, that's certain. We must all come to port sooner or later, at sea or on shore. We must be fast moored one day. Death's like the best bower anchor, as the saying is. It will bring us all up. I could not but signify my approbation of the justness of Jack's reflections, and inquired into the occasion of the quarrel between Captain Oakham and my uncle, which he explained in this manner. Captain Oakham, to be sure, is a good man enough. Besides, he's my commander. But what's that to me? I do my duty, and value no man's anger of a rope's end. Now the report goes, as how he's a lord or baron knight's brother, whereby d'ye see me? He carries a straight arm, and keeps aloof from his officers, though mayhap they may be as good men in the main as he. Now we lying at anchor in Tuberon Bay, Lieutenant Bowling had the middle watch, and as he always kept a good lookout, he made, d'ye see, 3 lights in the offing, whereby he ran down to the great cabin for orders, and found the captain asleep. Whereupon he waked him, which put him in a main high passion, and he swore woundily at the lieutenant, and called him lousy Scotch son of a whore, for I being then sentinel in the steerage, heard all, and swab and lubber, whereby the lieutenant returned the salute, and they jawed together fore and aft a good spell, till at last the captain turned out, and laying hold of a rattan, came athwart Mr. Bowling's quarter, whereby he told the captain that, if he was not his commander, he would heave him overboard, and demanded satisfaction ashore. Whereby in the morning watch, the captain went ashore in the pinnace, and afterwards the lieutenant carried the cutter ashore, and so they, leaving the boat's crews on their oars, went away together. And so, d'ye see, in less than a quarter of an hour we heard firing, whereby we made for the place, and found the captain lying wounded on the beach, and so brought him on board to the doctor, who cured him in less than 6 weeks. But the lieutenant clapped on all the sail he could bear, and had got far enough ahead before we knew anything of the matter, so that we could never after get sight of him, for which we were not sorry, because the captain was mainly wrath, and would certainly have done him a mischief. For he afterwards caused him to be run on the ship's books, whereby he lost all his pay, and if he should be taken, would be tried as a deserter. This account of the captain's behavior gave me no advantageous idea of his character, and I could not help lamenting my own fate that had subjected me to such a commander. However, making a virtue of necessity, I put a good face on the matter, and next day was, with the other pressed men, put on board of the Thunder, lying at the Nore. When we came alongside, the mate, who guarded us thither, ordered my handcuffs to be taken off, that I might get on board the easier. This circumstance being perceived by some of the company who stood upon the gangboard to see us enter, one of them called to Jack Ratlin, who was busied in doing this friendly office for me. "Hey, Jack, what Newgate galley have you boarded in the river as you came along? Have we not thieves enow among us already?" Another, observing my wounds, which remained exposed to the air, told me my seams were uncaulked, and that I must be new paid. A third, seeing my hair clotted together with blood, as it were into distinct cords, took notice that my bows were mended with the red ropes instead of my side. A fourth asked me if I could not keep my yard square without iron braces. And, in short, 1,000 witticisms of the same nature were passed upon me before I could get up the ship's side. After we had been all entered upon the ship's books, I inquired of one of my shipmates where the surgeon was, that I might have my wounds dressed, and had actually got as far as the middle deck, for our ship carried 80 guns, in my way to the cockpit, when I was met by the same midshipman who had used me so barbarously in the tender. He, seeing me free from my chains, asked, with an insolent air, who had released me. To this question I foolishly answered, with a countenance that too plainly declared the state of my thoughts, "Whoever did it, I am persuaded did not consult you in the affair." I had no sooner uttered these words than he cried, "Damn you, you saucy son of a hitch, I'll teach you to talk so to your officer." So saying, he bestowed on me several severe stripes with a supple jack he had in his hand, and, going to the commanding officer, made such a report of me that I was immediately put in irons by the master-at-arms, and a sentinel placed over me. Honest Ratlin, as soon as he heard of my condition, came to me and administered all the consolation he could, and then went to the surgeon in my behalf, who sent one of his mates to dress my wounds. This mate was no other than my old friend Thompson, with whom I became acquainted at the Navy office, as before mentioned. If I knew him at first sight, it was not easy for him to recognize me, disfigured with blood and dirt, and altered by the misery I had undergone. Unknown as I was to him, he surveyed me with looks of compassion and handled my sores with great tenderness. When he had applied what he thought proper and was about to leave me, I asked him if my misfortunes had disguised me so much that he could not recollect my face. Upon this address, he observed me with great earnestness for some time, and at length protested he could not recollect one feature of my countenance. To keep him no longer in suspense, I told him my name, which when he heard, he embraced me with affection, and professed his sorrow at seeing me in such a disagreeable situation. I made him acquainted with my story, and when he heard how inhumanly I had been used in the tender, he left me abruptly, assuring me I should see him again soon. I had scarce time to wonder at his sudden departure, when the master-at-arms came to the place of my confinement, and bade me follow him to the quarter-deck, where I was examined by the first lieutenant, who commanded the ship in the absence of the captain, touching the treatment I had received in the tender from my friend the midshipman, who was present to confront me. I recounted the particulars of his behavior to me, not only in the tender, but since my being on board the ship, part of which being proved by the evidence of Jack Ratlin and others, who had no great devotion for my oppressor, I was discharged from confinement to make way for him, who was delivered to the master-at-arms to take his turn in the bilboes. And this was not the only satisfaction I enjoyed, for I was, at the request of the surgeon, exempted from all other duty than that of assisting his mates in making and administering medicines to the sick. This good office I owed to the friendship of Mr. Thompson, who had represented me in such a favorable light to the surgeon, that he demanded me of the lieutenant to supply the place of his third mate, who was lately dead. When I had obtained this favor, my friend Thompson carried me down to the cockpit, which is the place allotted for the habitation of the surgeon's mates, and when he had shown me their berth, as he called it, I was filled with astonishment and horror. We descended by divers ladders to a space as dark as a dungeon, which, I understood, was immersed several feet under water, being immediately above the hold. I had no sooner approached this dismal gulf than my nose was saluted with an intolerable stench of putrefied cheese and rancid butter, that issued from an apartment at the foot of the ladder, resembling a chandler's shop, where, by the faint glimmering of a candle, I could perceive a man with a pale, meager countenance, sitting behind a kind of desk, having spectacles on his nose and a pen in his hand. This I learned of Mr. Thompson was the ship's steward, who sat there to distribute provision to the several messes and to mark what each received. He therefore presented my name to him and desired I might be entered in his mess. Then, taking a light in his hand, conducted me to the place of his residence, which was a square of about 6 feet, surrounded with the medicine chest, that of the first mate, his own, and a board by way of table fastened to the after powder room. It was also enclosed with canvas nailed round to the beams of the ship, to screen us from the cold, as well as from the view of the midshipmen and quartermaster, who lodged within the cable tiers on each side of us. In this gloomy mansion he entertained me with some cold salt pork, which he brought from a sort of locker fixed above the table, and calling for the boy of the mess, sent for a can of beer, of which he made excellent flip to crown the banquet. By this time I began to recover my spirits, which had been exceedingly depressed with the appearance of everything about me, and could no longer refrain from asking the particulars of Mr. Thompson's fortune, since I had seen him in London. He told me that being disappointed in his expectations of borrowing money to gratify the rapacious St. Rye at the Navy Office, he found himself utterly unable to subsist any longer in town, and had actually offered his service in quality of mate to the surgeon of a merchant ship, bound to Guinea on the slaving trade. When, one morning, a young fellow of whom he had some acquaintance came to his lodgings and informed him that he had seen a warrant made out in his name at the Navy Office for surgeon's second mate of a third rate. This unexpected piece of good news he could scarcely believe to be true, more especially as he had been found qualified at Surgeon's Hall for third mate only. But that he might not be wanting to himself, he went thither to be assured, and actually found it so. Whereupon, demanding his warrant, it was delivered to him, and the oaths administered immediately. That very afternoon he went to Gravesend in the tilt boat, from whence he took place in the tide coach for Rochester. Next morning got on board the Thunder, for which he was appointed, then lying in the harbor at Chatham, and the same day was mustered by the clerk of the check. And well it was for him that such expedition was used, for, in less than 12 hours after his arrival, another William Thompson came on board, affirming that he was the person for whom the warrant was expedited, and that the other was an impostor. My friend was grievously alarmed at this accident, the more so, as his namesake had very much the advantage over him both in assurance and dress. However, to acquit himself of the suspicion of imposture, he produced several letters written from Scotland to him in that name, and recollecting that his indentures were in a box on board, he brought them up, and convinced all present that he had not assumed a name which did not belong to him. His competitor, enraged that they should hesitate in doing him justice, for to be sure the warrant had been designed for him, behaved with so much indecent heat that the commanding officer, who was the same gentleman I had seen, and the surgeon were offended at his presumption, and making a point of it with their friends in town, in less than a week got the first confirmed in his station. "I have been on board," said he, "ever since, and as this way of life is becoming familiar to me, have no cause to complain of my situation. The surgeon is a good-natured, indolent man. The first mate, who is now on shore on duty, is indeed a little proud and choleric, as all Welshmen are, but in the main a friendly, honest fellow. The lieutenants I have no concern with, and, as for the captain, he is too much of a gentleman to know a surgeon's mate, even by sight." Chapter 25. The Behavior of Mr. Morgan, his pride, displeasure, and generosity, the economy of our mess described, Thompson's further friendship, the nature of my duty explained, the situation of the sick while he was thus discoursing to me, we heard a voice on the cockpit ladder pronounce with great vehemence, in a strange dialect, "The devil and his dam blow me from the top of Monchdenny, if I go to him before there is something in my pelly. Let his nose be as yellow as saffron, or as blue as a pell, look you, or as green as a leek, tea's all one." To this declaration somebody answered, "So it seems my poor messmate must part his cable for want of a little assistance. His foretopsail is loose already, and besides the doctor ordered you to overhaul him, but I see you don't mind what your master says." Here he was interrupted with, "Splutter and cons. You lousy tog, who do you call my master? Get you gone to the doctor, and tell him my birth and education and my abilities. And moreover, my behavior is as good as his, or any gentleman's, no disparagement to him, in the whole world. Cot bless my soul, I does he think, or conceive, or imagine that I am a horse, or an ass or a goat to trudge backwards and forwards, and upwards and downwards, and by sea and by land, at his will and pleasure. Go your ways, you rapscallion, and tell Dr. Atkins that I desire and request that he will give a look upon the tying man, and order something for him, if he be dead or alive, and I will see him take it by and by, when my craving stomach is satisfied, look you. At this, the other went away, saying, that if they should serve him so when he was dying, by God he would be foul of them in the other world. Here, Mr. Thompson let me know that the person we heard was Mr. Morgan, the first mate, who was just come on board from the hospital, whither he had attended some of the sick in the morning. At the same time, I saw him come into the berth. He was a short, thick man, with a face garnished with pimples, a snub nose turned up at the end, an excessive wide mouth, and little fiery eyes surrounded with skin puckered up in innumerable wrinkles. My friend immediately made him acquainted with my case, when he regarded me with a very lofty look, but without speaking, set down a bundle he had in his hand, and approached the cupboard, which, when he had opened, he exclaimed in a great passion, "Cod is my life, all the pork is gone, as I am a Christian." Thompson then gave him to understand that, as I had been brought on board half famished, he could do no less than to entertain me with what was in the locker, and the rather as he had bid the steward enter me in the mess. Whether this disappointment made Mr. Morgan more peevish than usual, or he really thought himself too little regarded by his fellow mate, I know not, but after some pause he went on in this manner. "Mr. Thompson, perhaps you do not use me with all the good manners, and complaisance, and respect. Look you, that becomes you, because you have not vouchsafed to advise with me in this affair. I have in my time, look you, been a man of some weight, and substance and consideration, and have kept house and home, and paid scot and lot, and the king's taxes. Ay, and maintained a family to boot. And moreover, also, I am your senior, and your older and your petter, Mr. Thompson, my elder I'll allow you to be, but not my better, cried Thompson with some heat. Cot is my savior and witness too, said Morgan, with great vehemence, that I am more elder, and therefore more petter by many years than you. Fearing this dispute might be attended with some bad consequence, I interposed and told Mr. Morgan I was very sorry for having been the occasion of any difference between him and the second mate, and that, rather than cause the least breach in their good understanding, I would eat my allowance to myself, or seek admission into some other company. But Thompson, with more spirit than discretion, as I thought, insisted upon my remaining where he had appointed me, and observed that no man, possessed of generosity and compassion, would have any objection to it, considering my birth and talents, and the misfortunes I had of late so unjustly undergone. This was touching Mr. Morgan on the right key, who protested with great earnestness that he had no objection to my being received in the mess, but only complained that the ceremony of asking his consent was not observed. As for a Sheltenman in distress, said he, shaking me by the hand, I loaf him as I loaf my own powels, for Cot help me. I have had vexations enough upon my own pack, and as I afterwards learned, in so saying, he spoke no more than what was true, for he had been once settled in a very good situation in Glamorganshire, and was ruined by being security for an acquaintance. All differences being composed, he untied his bundle, which consisted of 3 bunches of onions and a great lump of Cheshire cheese, wrapped up in a handkerchief, and, taking some biscuit from the cupboard, fell to with a keen appetite, inviting us to share of the repast. When he had fed heartily on his homely fare, he filled a large cup made of a cocoanut shell with brandy, and drinking it off told us, Prandy was the best menstruum for onions and sheese. Meanwhile, the sailor, whom Mr. No, thank God, death hadn't as yet boarded him. His starboard eye, said the sailor, is open but fast jammed in his head, and the halyards of his under jaw have given way. Passion of my heart, cried Morgan, the man is as pad as one would desire to be. Morgan, hearing this, exclaimed, Mercy upon my salvation! Why did you not stop him till I came? Stop him, said the other. I hailed him several times, but he was too far on his way, and the enemy had got possession of his close quarters, so that he did not mind me. Well, well, said he, we all owe heaven a teeth. While we entertained us with reflections suitable to this event, we heard the boatswain pipe to dinner, and immediately the boy belonging to our mess ran to the locker, from whence he carried off a large wooden platter, and in a few minutes returned with it full of boiled peas, crying scaldings all the way as he came. The cloth, consisting of a piece of an old sail, was instantly laid, covered with 3 plates, which by the color I could with difficulty discern to be metal, and as many spoons of the same composition, 2 of which were curtailed in the handles, and the other abridged in the lip. Mr. Morgan himself enriched this mess with a lump of salt butter scooped from an old gallipot, and a handful of onions shorn, with some pounded pepper. I was not very much tempted with the appearance of this dish, of which, nevertheless, my messmates ate heartily, advising me to follow their example, as it was Banyan Day, and we could have no meat till next noon. But I had already laid in sufficient for the occasion, and therefore desired to be excused, expressing a curiosity to know the meaning of Banyan Day. They told me that, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, the ship's company had no allowance of meat, and that these meager days were called Banyan Days, the reason of which they did not know. But I have since learned they take their denomination from a sect of devotees in some parts of the East Indies, who never taste flesh. After dinner, Thompson led me round the ship, showed me the different parts, described their uses, and, as far as he could, made me acquainted with the particulars of the discipline and economy practiced on board. He then demanded of the boatswain a hammock for me, which was slung in a very neat manner by my friend Jack Ratlin, and, as I had no bedclothes, procured credit for me with the purser, for a mattress and 2 blankets. At 7 o'clock in the evening, Morgan visited the sick, and having ordered what was proper for each, I assisted Thompson in making up his prescriptions. But when I followed him with the medicines into the sick berth or hospital and observed the situation of the patients, I was much less surprised that people should die on board than that a sick person should recover. Here I saw about 50 miserable distempered wretches, suspended in rows, so huddled one upon another, that not more than 14 inches space was allotted for each with his bed and bedding, and deprived of the light of the day as well as of fresh air. Breathing nothing but a noisome atmosphere of the morbid steams exhaling from their own excrements and diseased bodies, devoured with vermin hatched in the filth that surrounded them, and destitute of every convenience necessary for people in that helpless condition.